Well, welcome class to today's lesson. We're going to be talking about the subject of grammar for writing. How do we integrate grammar into composition? This is a very polarizing topic, as we've seen grammar come into, blend into the English classroom in a variety of ways. And we're going to talk about what I believe, based on research, is the best approach, and one way you can call it is grammar for writing. So our lessons for this, our goals for this lesson are these. Compare approaches to grammatical teaching. Like I said, from what we've seen in the 20th century, even before, to then what happened later in the 20th century into today. The pendulum has swung very diversely between both extremes. We're going to assess our own knowledge of grammar, or at least reflect. How does my grammatical knowledge affect my ability to teach in this manner? And then number 3, apply into a writing integrated pedagogical approach. So, comparing approaches. The traditional approach was that grammar was taught as its own core subject. You really learned grammar for the sake of learning grammar, and then you tried to apply that to writing. Well, what research was finding was that this was very daunting for students. You're learning all these terms, all these rules, all these mechanisms, and then within this vast knowledge, you need to write something that's perfect to this. What they were finding was this approach to teaching grammar was not helping students. If anything, it was actually hindering students. So today, now the other extreme we'll talk about in a second, now more in the middle is this idea of, well, let's integrate grammar into writing composition, because the goal is for an English class is for our students to become better what? Better readers, better writers. In understanding grammar, you're able to break down sentences and understand them. You're able to track with certain key words. And in writing, write with greater accuracy and clarity in a more consistent way. But the way that the pendulum has swung to the other extreme is that classrooms late in the 20th century and on here into the 21st century has really just kind of shut grammar away up into the attic and has acted like we don't really need to apply grammar or teach it, or if we do very, very sparsely, for students to become good writers. But here's the problem with that. Let me compare it to this, that I have a friend who is a really good mechanic, and he said he's worked with mechanics who really can only do certain things with certain vehicles because they've been trained for that job in certain garages. But if they were to go work on an old car or on a tractor or on a truck, they don't have that broad mechanical knowledge in order to perform those tasks. Same thing is true if we don't teach students really the core mechanics of good writing. They may be able to write well in a certain genre or a certain person or to a certain subject that they really, really like. But to consistently write well, regardless of the context that they find themselves in, they need to have the understanding of good writing and its mechanics. And so here, we're looking at the approach of integrated pedagogical approach, grammar for writing. So as teachers, here's where we have to start. What is our base knowledge of grammar? Now, in the course that I'm taking, in the courses throughout my master's, here next I'm going to be taking advanced college grammar, and that's really going to for sure test my grammar knowledge. But you don't even have to take a college course. You could take an assessment, a test, something to really assess, do I understand grammar, to where I can break down sentence structures and things like that for students to help them understand, hey, this is why this isn't working. You have this subordinating conjunction because. But because you started with this phrase before, because you're asking a question without asking a question. It's great. I love that you have a dependent clause, but now you need an independent clause. Let's put a comma here. Let's put a conjunction. Let's finish this thought. But I love that you're not just writing in short, choppy sentences anymore. It's great that you added this, but I want you to understand why it doesn't work without the independent clause. Recognize that so you can use this tool again. And you can make your sentences complex or compound complex. So assess your own grammar knowledge as a teacher. You have to. Because if you don't have a good knowledge base, you really can't teach grammar for writing. Okay, and then for grammar for writing, rather than teaching rules by which students write, the goal is to introduce grammatical tools as a way to revise and improve upon what students have already written. Because you see, students, we already kind of inherit knowledge of grammar by the books that we read as kids, by the books that we read, in school, and we don't necessarily understand or label the sentences and the structures, but we learn how to repeat them. We learn it by speech, because we often speak how we would write. And so we want to take what students can already create and say, let's make this better, and let me help you understand how and why this can become better. Okay? So, let's work, okay, as if this is, this. All right, so every clause, every sentence needs to have what? Two things. Right, basic knowledge, a noun and a verb, subject and a predicate. So let's go with this, because this is very trendy in writing today. The dragon. Seems like every novelist wants to write about dragons. At some point, they are going to go way out of style. All right, but the dragon. Well, we have the subject. What did the dragon do? Somebody give me a verb. The dragon loved it. The dragon bellowed. All right. Very creative verb. And I tell you what, for a lot of my middle school students, we could put a period right there and call the sentence done. The dragon bellowed. The dragon was hungry. The dragon flew into the sky. So here, we want to add more depth, more life to the sentence. So let's say we're taking this approach. You have your students write the first draft of a narrative essay. And you notice that a lot of your students are leaving verbs unmodified. They're not adding life to the verbs. So you got sentences like this: the dragon bellowed. Well, that's awesome. And so now you're having conferences with your students. You're going, okay, I've underlined all these verbs, but I want to bring greater life, greater character to these verbs. Let's describe them. Let's add modifiers called adverbs. And you've talked to your class about this. So, all right, class, we've talked about how we're leaving our verbs hanging, and we need to give them better life. So here's our subject, the dragon. We have to talk about this. The article, the dragon bellowed. This is a complete sentence, but let's give this sentence life. We're going to add adverbs in two ways. All right, so here's the new concept. We're going to put a comma here at the beginning, just for the sake of understanding its place. And before this comma, we're going to add what's called foreshadowing adverbial prepositional phrase. Or let's just call it a foreshadowing adverbial phrase for right now. That means that we're going to put a phrase up here that's going to describe bellowed. Let me give you an example of what that would look like. So, let's go from the depths. From the depths, the dragon bellowed. Somebody give me another one. In the darkness, I like that. Getting spooky. In the darkness, the dragon bellowed. Okay? And so you can continue on this way. Let students throw in these ideas. You can talk about prepositions, maybe have them learn that horrible, annoying song from YouTube on different prepositions. And talk about here, introduce adverbial prepositional phrases that brings greater life to our verb. But there's another way we can modify our verb. We can add adverbs. This might be where you talk about ly. From the depths, the dragon bellowed, what? Loudly. I like it. The dragon bellowed loudly. The dragon bellowed hungrily. Or the dragon bellowed lazily. Very good. So now here's where you're going to bring this full circle. You've seen a weak point in your students' writing. You've talked about it with them. Maybe you do a conference after the lesson, but I say you do a conference beforehand. You show them, hey, we're going to be talking about this. I really like what you've worked, but we can bring this to even more vivid life. You come up here in front of the class. You say, hey, here's how we're going to add to our verbs: adverbial prepositional phrases and adverbs. Now we have a great segue into doing, whether it's from curriculum, your materials, or whatever it might be, into talking about adverbs and adverbial prepositional phrases. Give them greater depth, understanding. Maybe this is where you go when you have a prepositional phrase at the beginning of the sentence. It's almost always going to be adverbial. Why? Because adjectival prepositional phrases almost always come after the noun that they modify. So now you can go deeper into the grammar so that students can recognize this use of these grammatical tools, implement them into their writing, and become a more consistent, proficient, productive writer. That is the goal of doing grammar for writing. Well, thank you for joining me for today's lesson. I hope this is helpful. I hope this encourages you to really work on your grammar knowledge and to integrate it into your pedagogical approach, into teaching composition.